When Maria Santos bought the old Whispering Pines cabin in 2024, she planned to turn it into her dream home. What she didn't plan on was finding a hidden compartment in the attic containing a 31-year-old video camera, still loaded with a tape. The timestamp read July 17, 1993, the night before the Johnson family vanished. As Maria pressed play, she had no idea she was about to witness the last hours of a family that the world had been searching for since the Clinton administration. July 15, 1993. The Johnson family drove through the winding roads of northern Minnesota, their blue Buick loaded with suitcases, coolers, and the excitement of a long-awaited family vacation. David Johnson, 42, gripped the steering wheel with the satisfied smile of a man who had finally managed to take time off from his insurance office. Beside him, his wife Patricia, 39, consulted a handwritten map while humming along to the radio. In the back seat, their two children argued over a Game Boy. 12-year-old Emma and 10-year-old Michael, both buzzing with the energy that only comes with the promise of a week away from school and responsibilities. The Whispering Pines cabin sat like a postcard scene at the edge of Lake Minnewaska, its log walls weathered to a comfortable gray, surrounded by towering pines that swayed gently in the summer breeze. The Johnson family had found the rental through a small ad in the Minneapolis Tribune, drawn by the promise of complete privacy and natural beauty. What they didn't know was that they were the first guests the cabin had seen in over 3 years. The property manager, Earl Hendricks, met them at the front door with keys and a sheepish apology about the cabin's rustic charm. At 73, Earl moved slowly but spoke with the practiced ease of someone who had been managing vacation rentals since before the internet existed. He showed them the basics: how to work the old pump for the well water, where to find extra blankets, how to light the gas stove that sometimes needed coaxing. What he didn't mention was the small video camera he had installed in the attic after a series of break-ins the previous year, or that he sometimes used it to keep an eye on guests who seemed suspicious. The first 2 days passed like pages from a vacation brochure. David taught Michael how to cast a fishing line from the small dock while Patricia and Emma collected smooth stones along the shoreline. They grilled hamburgers on the outdoor barbecue, played board games by lamplight, and fell asleep to the gentle lapping of water against the shore. Emma wrote in her diary about how this was the best vacation ever. Michael caught his first fish and insisted on taking a photo with it. Patricia sketched the view from the cabin porch in her small notebook. David actually relaxed for the first time in months, his shoulders losing the tight set they had carried since his promotion to regional manager. But rural Minnesota in July holds secrets in its forests and lakes, and the Johnson family was about to discover that some places remember things that were never meant to be remembered. On the evening of July 17, their third night at the cabin, Patricia noticed something odd while washing dishes at the kitchen sink. Through the window, she could see a light flickering between the trees on the far side of the lake. Not the steady glow of another cabin's windows, but something that pulsed and moved, like a flashlight being waved in patterns. She called David over to look, but by the time he joined her at the window, the light had vanished. Earl Hendricks, meanwhile, was at his own home 10 miles away, dealing with a plumbing emergency that had flooded his basement. He wouldn't check the video feed from the cabin's attic camera until much later, and by then it would be too late to help anyone. That night, as the Johnson family settled in for what they thought would be another peaceful evening of vacation, something began to move through the forest surrounding Whispering Pines. Local law enforcement would later identify these figures as members of a survivalist group that had been operating in the area for several months, but in July of 1993, the Johnson family had no way of knowing that their perfect lakeside retreat sat directly in the path of something much darker than they could imagine. The hidden camera in the attic had been recording continuously since their arrival, its motion sensors triggered by the family's normal activities, making breakfast, playing games, walking around the cabin. But at 11:47 p.m. on July 17, the camera captured something that would remain hidden for 31 years. David Johnson was the first to hear the sounds outside. A soft scratching against the cabin's log walls, like tree branches in the wind, except there was no wind that night. The lake lay perfectly still under a half-moon, its surface like black glass. He moved quietly to the living room window and peered through the curtains, but saw only darkness and the familiar silhouettes of pine trees. Patricia had fallen asleep on the couch with a book in her lap while the children were upstairs in the loft bedroom they shared, whispering and giggling long past their usual bedtime. The vacation had relaxed all their normal rules, and David found himself reluctant to enforce lights out when they were having so much fun. The scratching sound came again, more deliberate this time, moving along the south wall of the cabin toward the back door. David's instincts, sharpened by years of assessing insurance risks, told him something was wrong. He moved to wake Patricia, but froze when he heard a new sound: footsteps on the cabin's back porch, slow and careful, as if someone was testing each board before putting their full weight on it. Through the kitchen window, Patricia's eyes snapped open and met David's across the room. She had heard it too. Without speaking, they both understood that this was not a friendly late-night visitor or a lost hiker seeking directions. There was something predatory in the careful way the footsteps circled the cabin, pausing at each window as if studying the interior layout. Emma and Michael upstairs had grown quiet, their childhood instincts alerting them to the change in atmosphere even if they couldn't identify the source of their sudden unease. From their loft window, Emma could see shapes moving between the trees, too tall and angular to be animals, too deliberate in their movements to be anything natural. David made the first crucial decision of that night. Instead of calling out to identify the visitors or turning on the exterior lights, he moved silently to the small closet near the front door where Earl had shown him the cabin's emergency supplies. Inside, along with first aid supplies and a battery-powered radio, he found a hunting rifle that the property manager had mentioned was available for guests who wanted to hunt small game. The weapon felt foreign in his hands. David had never been a hunter, had never fired anything more dangerous than a paintball gun at an office team-building event. But as the footsteps on the porch multiplied, now clearly belonging to more than one person, he understood that the normal rules of civilized interaction had somehow been suspended in this isolated place. Patricia had moved to the bottom of the stairs leading to the loft, positioning herself between the main floor and her children. Her maternal instincts had kicked into high gear, and she was calculating distances, exit routes, ways to get Emma and Michael to safety if whatever was outside decided to come inside. The hidden camera in the attic continued to record, its infrared sensors capturing everything in stark black and white. Later analysis would show that at least 4 figures had surrounded the cabin, moving with the coordinated precision of people who had done this before. They wore dark clothing and moved in ways that suggested military or paramilitary training, checking blind spots and covering each other's movements as they tightened their circle around the Johnson family's temporary refuge. At 12:15 a.m., the probing stopped. The footsteps ceased, the scratching sounds ended, and the night fell silent except for the normal sounds of a Minnesota forest, the distant call of a loon, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the gentle lap of water against the shoreline. David and Patricia waited, barely breathing, for 20 minutes before either dared to move. When David finally crept to the front window and peered out, the yard appeared empty. The pale moonlight illuminated nothing but grass, trees, and the Buick parked where they had left it. But something had changed in the air around the cabin, a charge like the moment before a thunderstorm, as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath. Patricia had moved upstairs to check on the children, finding them huddled together in the larger of the 2 twin beds, eyes wide with the particular fear that children experience when they sense their parents are afraid. She whispered reassurances, told them it was probably just raccoons or deer, but her own trembling hands betrayed her uncertainty. The family spent the remainder of that night taking shifts, one adult always awake and watching while the other tried to rest. Emma and Michael eventually fell back asleep, exhaustion overcoming their anxiety, but David and Patricia remained vigilant until the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the cabin windows. July 18th dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect summer morning that makes the fears of the night before seem overblown and foolish. Over breakfast, the family discussed what had happened, with David and Patricia downplaying the incident for the children's sake while privately agreeing that they should probably cut their vacation short and return home to Minneapolis. But leaving required packing, cleaning the cabin, and settling accounts with Earl Hendricks, all of which would take most of the day. They decided to stay one more night and leave early on the morning of July 19th, a decision that would prove to be their last as a family. The hidden camera captured their normal vacation activities throughout that final day, packing suitcases, cleaning dishes, Emma making one last entry in her vacation diary while Michael played with action figures on the living room floor. At 3:30 p.m., Earl Hendricks called the cabin to check on his guests and confirm their checkout time, a conversation that David took at the kitchen phone while Patricia organized their belongings. What the camera also captured, though the Johnson family remained unaware of it, were the figures that had returned to the forest around the cabin. This time they made no attempt to approach the building directly, but maintained a watchful presence at the tree line, waiting for something that only they understood. As evening approached on July 18, Patricia felt the same unease that had gripped her the night before, but David encouraged her to push through it. They had survived one night of strange visitors, and they would be leaving in less than 12 hours. What harm could come from one more evening at Whispering Pines? The hidden camera would record the answer to that question in excruciating detail. At 7:45 p.m., the Johnson family finished their last dinner at the cabin, leftover hamburgers and potato salad that they ate on the screened porch while watching the sun set over Lake Minnewaska. The children seemed to have recovered completely from the previous night's scare, chattering about going back to school and telling their friends about their fishing adventures. Patricia allowed herself to relax slightly, thinking that perhaps her fears had been overblown. But as darkness fell for the second time since the mysterious visitors had first appeared, the atmosphere around Whispering Pines began to change again. The camera's motion sensors detected movement at the edge of the property at 9:20 p.m., then again at 9:35, then continuously as multiple figures took positions in the forest surrounding the cabin. This time, they weren't content to simply observe. At 10:15 p.m., as the Johnson family played a final round of Monopoly by lamplight in the living room, the first deliberate sound came from outside. A single, sharp knock on the front door, followed by complete silence. David and Patricia froze, game pieces forgotten, while Emma and Michael looked toward their parents for guidance on how to respond. After 30 seconds of silence, David approached the door but didn't open it. "Hello," he called out, his voice carefully neutral. "Can I help you?" The response came not as words, but as another sound, a rhythmic tapping on the cabin's side wall, moving from the front toward the back in a deliberate pattern that suggested someone was using the building itself as a means of communication. Patricia had already moved to gather the children, her earlier fears now fully justified and sharpening into protective fury. Whatever was happening outside was no accident or misunderstanding. Someone was deliberately trying to frighten them, and she would not allow her children to be terrorized in what should have been a safe family vacation. The hidden camera captured what happened next with pitiless clarity. At 10:22 p.m., 3 figures emerged from the forest and walked directly toward the cabin's front door, no longer bothering with stealth or subtlety. They wore dark clothing and moved with purpose, while a 4th figure remained in the trees, presumably as a lookout or backup. David, still holding the hunting rifle he had retrieved from the closet, made the second crucial decision of that night. Instead of retreating to the back of the cabin with his family, he moved to confront whatever threat was approaching his temporary home. The camera shows him unlocking the front door and stepping onto the porch, the rifle held low but ready, as 3 strangers approached through the moonlit yard. The audio quality was poor, but investigators would later enhance the recording enough to make out fragments of the conversation that followed. The lead figure spoke first, his voice calm and conversational despite the late hour and isolated location. He claimed to be looking for a lost hiker, a member of their group who had wandered away from their campsite earlier that day. He asked if the Johnson family had seen anyone matching the description, a young man, early 20s, wearing a red jacket and carrying a large backpack. David's response was cautious but not hostile. He explained that they hadn't seen anyone fitting that description, but offered to help search if needed. The exchange seemed normal, even neighborly, despite the unusual circumstances. But Patricia, watching from the living room window with Emma and Michael pressed close beside her, noticed something that David couldn't see from his position on the porch. The 4th figure, the one who had remained in the trees, was no longer in the same spot. He had moved closer to the cabin, and was now positioned near their car, effectively blocking the most obvious escape route. The conversation on the porch continued for nearly 10 minutes, with the strangers asking detailed questions about the Johnson family's activities over the past few days, their planned departure time, and whether they had seen any other people in the area. David answered honestly, still believing he was dealing with legitimate concern for a missing person. But when one of the men casually asked about the hunting rifle David carried, the tone of the interaction began to shift. The question was phrased as friendly interest. Where had he been hunting? What kind of game was he after? But something in the man's voice suggested a different kind of calculation. David's insurance background had taught him to recognize when people were gathering information for purposes they didn't want to reveal, and he finally began to understand that this midnight visit was not what it appeared to be. His realization came too late. At 10:34 p.m., the camera captured the moment when the conversation on the porch ended and the real purpose of the visit began. The details of what followed would be studied by law enforcement for decades, analyzed frame by frame, but the basic sequence of events was brutal in its simplicity. The Johnson family was taken. Not killed, not murdered in the traditional sense that most people imagine when they think about violent crime. They were taken, removed from the cabin with their belongings, loaded into vehicles that were never identified, and transported to locations that would remain unknown for 31 years. The hidden camera recorded David being overpowered on the porch, Patricia and the children being escorted from the cabin with calm efficiency, and the systematic removal of personal belongings to make it appear as though the family had left voluntarily. The entire operation took less than 40 minutes. By 11:15 p.m. on July 18, 1993, the Johnson family had vanished from Whispering Pines, leaving behind only their rental car with the engine running and the doors left open, creating the illusion that they had suddenly and inexplicably walked away from their lives. The camera continued recording for another 6 hours, capturing nothing but an empty cabin and the gradual arrival of dawn over Lake Minnewaska. Earl Hendricks discovered the scene the next morning when the family failed to check out at their agreed time. Finding their car still running in the driveway and their belongings apparently gone, he called local law enforcement and reported what appeared to be an unexplained disappearance. The investigation that followed was thorough but ultimately fruitless. The Johnson family had seemingly evaporated, leaving no trace of where they had gone or why they had left. Investigators found no signs of struggle, no ransom demands, no evidence of foul play beyond the running car and open doors. The case generated significant media attention throughout the summer of 1993, but as months passed without new developments, public interest faded and the Johnson disappearance joined the ranks of unsolved mysteries that law enforcement agencies prefer not to discuss in detail. Earl Hendricks never mentioned the hidden camera in the attic. Whether from embarrassment about spying on his guests, legal concerns about recording people without permission, or simple oversight in the chaos following the discovery, the camera remained his secret. After the investigation concluded, he sealed off the attic access and eventually forgot about the recording equipment entirely. When he sold the property in 1998, the camera was never mentioned in the disclosure documents. The Whispering Pines cabin changed hands 3 more times over the following decades, each owner drawn by the property's natural beauty and lakefront location, each eventually moving on for reasons they couldn't quite articulate. Some complained about strange sounds at night. Others mentioned an indefinable feeling of unease that made the cabin feel less like a retreat and more like a place where something had gone wrong. Maria Santos, a freelance graphic designer from Minneapolis, bought the property in March 2024 with plans to convert it into a year-round residence where she could work remotely and enjoy the peace of rural Minnesota. She had no knowledge of the cabin's history when she signed the purchase agreement. The real estate agent had mentioned that a family had once disappeared from the property, but presented it as a curiosity rather than a tragedy, just one of those unexplained mysteries that add character to older properties. Maria's renovation plans were ambitious but straightforward. She wanted to modernize the kitchen and bathroom, add insulation and updated wiring, and convert the unused attic space into a home office with skylights overlooking the lake. It was during the attic renovation, on a warm afternoon in late June, that her contractor made the discovery that would finally solve the Johnson family mystery. Mike Rodriguez had been working on the electrical updates when his drill bit punched through what should have been solid wall and instead encountered empty space behind the attic's north wall. Investigation revealed a hidden compartment, deliberately constructed and sealed, containing not only the video camera but also a collection of personal items that had belonged to the Johnson family. Emma's diary, with its final entry describing the best vacation ever. Michael's collection of smooth stones from the lakeshore. Patricia's sketch pad with its careful drawings of the cabin and surrounding forest. David's reading glasses, still in their case. And the camera, its tape still loaded, its batteries somehow still functional after more than 3 decades. Maria contacted local law enforcement immediately, and within hours the Whispering Pines cabin was once again surrounded by police vehicles and investigative equipment. But this time, they had evidence. Detective Sarah Chen, who had taken over the cold case unit for the county sheriff's department, arrived at the scene with no expectations beyond cataloging another dead-end lead in a case that had frustrated investigators for decades. She certainly didn't expect to be handed a complete video record of what had happened to the Johnson family. Watching the tape required emotional preparation that no amount of police training can provide. Chen had investigated violent crimes, missing persons cases, and unexplained deaths, but she had never before seen the systematic disappearance of an entire family recorded in real time. The video quality was poor by modern standards, grainy and dark, with audio that required digital enhancement to understand clearly. But the sequence of events was unmistakable, and the implications were staggering. The Johnson family hadn't walked away from their lives. They had been taken by people who knew exactly what they were doing, who had planned and executed the operation with military precision, and who had successfully concealed their crime for 31 years. But the tape also provided something that investigators in 1993 had desperately needed: faces, voices, and enough identifying details to begin tracking the perpetrators even after 3 decades had passed. Detective Chen immediately contacted the FBI's cold case unit and requested assistance with what was now clearly a kidnapping investigation with possible interstate implications. The federal agents who responded brought with them access to databases, facial recognition technology, and investigative resources that hadn't existed in 1993. The breakthrough came within 6 weeks of the video's discovery. Enhanced facial recognition analysis of the men captured on the tape matched 2 individuals who had been subjects of federal investigation in the early 1990s, Marcus Webb and Robert Torres, members of a survivalist group called the Northern Alliance that had operated throughout the upper Midwest during that period. Both men were still alive in 2024, living under different names in different states, but their fingerprints and DNA profiles were on file from previous arrests on weapons charges. Torres was located in Wyoming, working as a ranch hand under an assumed identity. Webb was found in northern Michigan, running a small survival training business that catered to weekend warriors and hunting enthusiasts. The arrests were coordinated and simultaneous, carried out by federal agents who had spent weeks preparing for the possibility that both men might resist or attempt to flee. But when confronted with the video evidence and the enhanced audio from the cabin, both suspects collapsed psychologically. Torres broke first, providing details about the Northern Alliance's activities in exchange for a plea agreement that would keep him off death row. Webb followed 24 hours later, offering information about what had really happened to the Johnson family. The truth, when it finally emerged, was somehow both better and worse than investigators had imagined. The Johnson family had been taken, but they had not been killed. The Northern Alliance had been operating what they called a relocation program, targeting families who matched specific criteria and forcing them to join survivalist communities in remote areas of Montana and Idaho. The kidnapped families were held in isolated compounds, their identities erased, their previous lives systematically destroyed through psychological manipulation and physical isolation. Children were separated from parents and raised according to the group's ideology. Adults were forced to work in support of the community's goals, which included recruiting additional families through similar kidnapping operations. The Johnson family had been transported to a compound in northwestern Montana, where they had lived for nearly 15 years before the community was disbanded following internal conflicts and federal pressure on similar groups after the Oklahoma City bombing. David Johnson had died in 2008, apparently from a heart attack brought on by the stress of captivity and repeated escape attempts. Patricia had been moved to a different location in 2003 and had lost contact with her children, who were being raised in yet another compound in rural Idaho. Emma and Michael Johnson, now adults with new identities and no clear memory of their original family life, were located through painstaking investigation that involved multiple federal agencies and cooperation from local law enforcement in 6 states. The reunion, when it finally occurred in a secure federal facility in Minneapolis, was both miraculous and heartbreaking. Patricia recognized her children immediately, despite their physical changes and the psychological conditioning they had undergone. But Emma and Michael struggled to connect the woman before them with fragmented memories of someone they had been taught to think of as a past life that no longer mattered. Recovery would take years, possibly decades. The psychological trauma of prolonged captivity, forced separation, and systematic brainwashing had left marks that might never fully heal. But the Johnson family was together again, and the people responsible for their disappearance would face justice for their crimes. The Whispering Pines cabin stands empty again as of 2024, its renovation abandoned when Maria Santos decided she couldn't continue living in a place where such trauma had occurred. The property is currently for sale, though the real estate agent admits that finding buyers has been challenging given the renewed media attention surrounding the case. The hidden camera that captured the Johnson family's disappearance has been entered into evidence and will likely remain in federal custody for years as the various trials and legal proceedings work their way through the court system. Detective Chen, who led the investigation that finally solved the case, keeps a photo of the Johnson family reunion on her desk, a reminder that even the coldest cases can sometimes have endings that nobody expected. The videotape that remained hidden for 31 years serves as proof that truth, like buried treasure, sometimes waits patiently in the darkness until someone is brave enough to dig it up and bring it into the light.